The light was on again. I noticed it the way you notice something that has been there so long it has become part of the landscape. Not with surprise, not with particular attention, just with the low grade awareness of a man sitting on his own porch in the dark who has run out of things to look at except the one thing that keeps being there. The farmhouse across the hollow had been empty for 11 years. I knew this because I had watched it be empty for 11 years, from this same porch, in this same chair, on more evenings than I could count. And then one Thursday in September, the light came on. Not all the lights, just the one on the porch. The yellow porch light on the left side of the front door. The kind that burns warm and low and means someone is home, means someone is expecting something or someone, or at the very least has decided that the dark is not something they want to sit in alone tonight. I sat in my chair and looked at the light across the hollow, and I thought, someone moved in. This sounds simple. It was not simple. The Alderton farmhouse, that's what everyone in Harlan County called it. The Alderton place, after the family that had owned it before the bank took it, had been a particular kind of empty, the kind that goes beyond vacancy into something closer to abandonment. The porch had a board missing on the second step. The window in the east gable had a crack running corner to corner. The kitchen garden had gone entirely to Queen Anne's lace and ironweed. For 11 years, I had looked at it from my porch across the hollow and thought, that place needs someone who knows what to do with it. My name is Eli. I'm 34 years old, and I farm 312 acres in Harlan County, Kentucky, which is a smaller acreage than my grandfather ran and a larger acreage than my father managed to keep, which tells you something about the intervening history that I don't need to go into here. I raise beef cattle and grow burley tobacco and keep a kitchen garden that is my grandmother's original plot, marked by the same stone borders she laid in 1962. I live alone in the house my great-grandfather built in 1931, which has a porch that faces southeast across a hollow to the Alderton place, and on which I sit every evening when the work is done, which is the one habit I have maintained without exception through 11 years of solitary farming. The light stayed on. Not just that Thursday. Every night after that, when I came to my porch in the evening, the porch light across the hollow was burning. Yellow, low, steady. The kind of light that means occupied, rather than the kind that means someone forgot to turn it off. There is a difference, and I had been looking at empty farmhouses long enough to know it. This light was deliberate. This light was a decision. I did not go over. I want to be clear about why, because the why matters for the rest of this story. I did not go over because I had been alone in this hollow for 11 years, and I had arranged my life around that solitude in the way that a man arranges furniture. Not because he loves the arrangement, but because he has been living with it long enough that moving anything feels like more trouble than it's worth. I got up at 5:30, I worked until the light was gone, I sat on my porch in the evening, I went to bed. I had neighbors in the general sense. The Praters were 3 miles east, the Combs family 4 miles west, but nobody in the specific sense of someone who was there when I looked up from my own porch. Nobody whose light I could see from where I sat. Now there was a light. Now here's what I want to ask you before I go any further, because I've been turning this over for months, and I still don't have a clean answer. If you had been alone in a hollow for 11 years and a light came on across the way, just a porch light, steady every night, the clear signal of another person's presence, how long would it take you to walk over? A week? A month? Would you wait for them to come to you? Leave me your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this story is already doing something to you, hit the like button right now. It means more than you know. Because what happened over the next 6 months, and the specific evening it ended, is the part I have been trying to find the right words for since October. I watched the light for 2 weeks before I found out who had moved in. I found out not by going over, but by running into Darlene Combs at the feed store in town, who told me with the specific satisfaction of someone delivering news they've been saving, that a woman named Rosie Callahan had bought the Alderton place at auction in August, and had been fixing it up herself for the past month. Darlene said she was maybe 30, maybe 31, had come from somewhere in Virginia, had a truck and a dog and no apparent reason for buying a rundown farmhouse in Harlan County except that she wanted one. I said, "Is she farming it?" Darlene said, "Trying to. Putting in an orchard," I heard. "Apple and pear, fixing the fencing herself," I said. "By herself?" Darlene gave me the look she reserved for men who underestimated the practical capacity of women. She said, "That's what I said." I went home and sat on my porch and looked at the light across the hollow and thought about a woman fixing fencing by herself and putting in an orchard in Harlan County in September, which meant she was either very capable or very stubborn or both, and either way, I found myself thinking about it longer than I had planned to. The light kept burning. October arrived, and with it the specific quality of Kentucky autumn in the hills, which is the most beautiful thing I have witnessed reliably every year of my life, and which does not lose its weight no matter how many times you see it. The hollow went from green to gold to the deep amber red that belongs only to October in these hills, and every evening when I came to my porch, the light was on across the way, steady and yellow against the darkening trees. I still did not go over, but I started listening. I am a farmer. I have always paid attention to weather and season and the specific sounds of a hollow in the early morning, and what I started hearing in October was the sound of work being done across the hollow, the ringing of a post hole digger in the rocky hill soil, the particular sound of fence wire being stretched. Once, on a still morning, the unmistakable sound of someone swearing at a thing that wasn't cooperating, which I have done myself 10,000 times, and which carried across the hollow with a clarity that made me smile at my coffee. I did not go over. I smiled at my coffee. This is the behavior of a man who has been alone too long. November came. The orchard trees went in. I could see them from the ridge above my upper pasture, a row of young bare root whips in the old kitchen garden that had been cleared and tilled and amended. She had done the soil work herself. I could tell from the quality of the rows, which were even and properly spaced, the work of someone who knew what they were doing. The dog appeared occasionally on the ridgeline, a large brown dog, moving with the loose energy of a working dog who has been given a job they like. I watched all of this from a distance of 300 yards, and I told myself I was simply being a good neighbor by paying attention to what was happening on the land adjacent to mine, and not that I had started specifically watching for the particular moment when I might catch sight of the woman who was doing it. I was lying to myself. The light burned on, every night, steady, the yellow porch light on the left side of the front door of the Alderton farmhouse across the hollow. I had been watching it for 2 months. I had been watching it so consistently that I now knew things about her evening routine that I had no business knowing. That she came to her porch around 7:30, that she stayed out for an hour in good weather, that she sometimes had a light in the window beside the door that meant she was reading, and that the porch light was the last thing she turned off before bed. It had become the rhythm of my evenings. In December, something happened that I had not anticipated. I was checking the cattle in the upper pasture on a gray Wednesday morning when I found a section of fence down on the western boundary, my boundary with the Alderton property. It was an old fence, one I'd been meaning to repair for 2 seasons, and what had taken it down was a combination of a fallen elm and the general deterioration of posts that were older than I was. I walked the line assessing the damage, and then I looked across the boundary into the Alderton land and I saw her. She was maybe 40 yards away, also walking fence line, also assessing. She had a brown Carhartt coat and mud on her boots, and her dark hair was pulled back under a wool cap, and she was looking at the downed section of fence from her side with the expression of someone calculating what it was going to take to fix it. She had not seen me yet. I stood completely still for a moment that was slightly too long. Then she looked up. Our eyes met across the downed fence line and the 40 yards of gray December pasture between us. She said nothing for a moment. Then she raised one hand. Not a wave exactly, more the acknowledgement one farmer gives another across a fence line, the specific greeting of two people who share a boundary. I raised mine back. She called across, "Your elm or mine?" I looked at the tree. It had come down from my side. I said, "Mine. I'll get it." She nodded. She looked at the fence line again and then back at me. She said, "I'm Rosie, the Alderton place." I said, "I know. I'm Eli, the Beckett place." She said, "I know." And that was the first conversation. 40 yards across a downed fence line in December. Names exchanged, responsibility for an elm established. She went back to walking her fence, and I went back to mine, and we did not speak again that day. But I walked home across the pasture thinking about the way she had said, "I know," the same way I had said it. The specific acknowledgement of two people who have been watching each other across a hollow for 2 months without saying so. I came to my porch that evening and the light was on. I fixed the fence the following Saturday, cleared the elm, replaced 4 posts, stretched new wire. It took most of the day. I was setting the last post when I heard boots on frozen ground and looked up, and she was there. On her side of the boundary, Carhartt coat, wool cap, the brown dog at her heel. She looked at the fence, then at me. She said, "You do good work." I said, "My grandfather built this fence the first time." She said, "I know, you can tell." She reached down and scratched the dog's ear. I said, "What's his name?" She said, "Ptolemy." I said, "Ptolemy?" She said, "He came with the name. I kept it." I said, "It suits him." She looked at Ptolemy, who was regarding me with the serious assessment of a dog who takes his opinions about people seriously. She said, "He likes you." I said, "How can you tell?" She said, "He's not barking." I looked at the dog. He was not barking. I said, "That's a low bar." She said, "For Ptolemy, it's a compliment." I finished the fence. She stood on her side of it with her dog and watched me work without making it feel like being watched, which is a specific skill that not many people have. When I was done, she said, "I have coffee on if you want." I said, "I've got cattle to check." She said, "Another time then." She turned and walked back toward the Alderton farmhouse with Ptolemy at her heel, and I watched her go and thought, "Another time." January arrived. I found a reason to check that fence line more often than it required. I am not proud of this, but I am reporting it accurately. Twice I found her there also walking her boundary for reasons that seemed as invented as mine, and we talked across the fence the way neighbors talk. Weather, the cattle, the orchard, the specific problems of farming Rocky Hill ground in winter. She was direct in a way I found immediately comfortable, the way of someone who has decided that precision is more respectful than indirection. She asked practical questions and gave practical answers, and did not fill silence with noise, which is a quality I have found in very few people and which I value beyond my ability to explain it. The light burned on every night. In February, she came over. Not to the fence, to my porch. I heard boots on the porch steps at 6 in the evening on a Tuesday, and opened the door, and she was standing there with a jar of preserves, and Ptolemy sitting on the step below her. She said, "I put up too many last fall. Apple butter. I thought you might want some." I said, "I'd like that." She handed me the jar. She looked past me into the house for a moment, not nosily, just with the evaluating eye of someone who pays attention to the quality of spaces. And then she looked at my porch. She said, "This is a good porch." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Better than mine. Mine needs work." I said, "I noticed the second step." She looked at me. "You noticed the second step from across the hollow?" I said, "I've had 11 years to look at that porch." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, "How long did you know the place was empty?" I said, "The whole 11 years." She said, "Did it bother you, having an empty place across the way?" I thought about it. "More than I realized until the light came on," I said. She looked at me for a moment with the specific quality of someone receiving information they had suspected but wanted confirmed. Then she said, "I'll fix the step." I said, "I can help with that." She said, "I know you can." She turned and went back down my porch steps with Ptolemy. At the bottom, she turned and said, "The apple butter is good with biscuits." I said, "I make good biscuits." She said, "I know." I said, "How do you know?" She said, "Darlene Combs." I should have known it would be Darlene Combs. March. The second step got fixed. I came over with lumber and tools on a Saturday morning, and she had already torn out the rotten board, which is the specific behavior of someone who does not wait for other people to start things. We worked on it together, which took less time than either of us would have taken alone. And afterward, she made coffee, and we sat on her repaired porch and looked across the hollow at my place, and she said, "Your porch faces better." I said, "Southeast, gets the morning light." She said, "Mine gets the evening." I said, "That's why I can see your light." She looked at me. I had not planned to say that. She said, "You can see the porch light from your place." I said, "Every night since September." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." I said, "You know?" She said, "I can see your porch from mine. I've been watching you sit out there every evening since I moved in." I sat on Rosie Callahan's repaired porch in March with a cup of coffee in my hand and understood that we had been watching each other across a hollow for 6 months. She said, "I wondered when you'd come over." I said, "I fixed the fence in December." She said, "That doesn't count and you know it." I said, "I brought lumber in March." She said, "Also doesn't count." I said, "When does it count?" She looked out at the hollow. The March light was doing what March light does in the Kentucky hills, which is to come in low and gold and make everything look like the beginning of something. She said, "When you come over without a reason." I looked at the hollow, at my porch across it, the one that faced southeast and got the morning light. At the 6 months of evenings I had spent sitting on it watching a light burn across the way. I said, "I should have come sooner." She said, "You came when you were ready." I said, "I think I was ready in October." She said, "October was fast. You'd only been watching the light for a month." I said, "Were you watching to see how long it would take?" She said, "I was keeping the light on." I sat with that sentence for a long moment. I said, "Why?" She looked at me, the specific quality of her look, direct, unhurried, the look of someone who has thought about what she is about to say and has decided to say it plainly, was by then familiar enough to me that I knew what came after it was going to be the true thing. She said, "Because I'd seen you on your porch every evening since I got here, and I could tell you'd been sitting on that porch alone for a long time. And I thought, if he can see my light, he'll know someone's there, and when he's ready, he'll come." I said, "That's a long way to introduce yourself." She said, "I'm not from here. I didn't know the customs." I said, "The custom is you bring a pie." She said, "I brought apple butter." I said, "Close enough." We sat on her porch until the afternoon went to evening, and the March cold came back in from the ridgeline, and she brought out a blanket, and we split it without discussing it, and the hollow went from gold to gray to the specific blue of a Kentucky evening in early spring, and at some point Ptolemy put his head on my knee, and we both pretended not to notice. I went home at dark, walked back across the hollow the way I had walked it 100 times in the last 6 months, but in daylight now, properly, with her watching from her porch. At my gate, I turned and looked back. She was still there. The porch light came on. I waved. She raised her hand. It is now October, the 2nd October. The hollow has gone gold again, and the apple trees in her orchard are loaded for the first time, small and green and hard, but real. The first fruit of a thing she put in the ground a year ago in faith. I helped her net them against the birds last week, which took 2 days and considerable argument about the best method, and which ended in her being right about the method and me finding this entirely acceptable, which is information about where we are. I sit on my porch in the evenings still. The difference is that some evenings she comes over, and some evenings I go there. And on the evenings we are each on our own porch, we can see each other's lights across the hollow, and that is enough. That has always been enough. The light meaning someone is there, meaning the hollow is not empty, meaning the specific solitude of a man on a porch in the Kentucky hills has become the specific companionship of two people who can see each other's porches from their own. Last week, she said something I have been thinking about. We were on my porch, the southeast facing one, the one that gets the morning light, and the October evening was doing its particular thing with the colors in the hollow, and she said, I bought that place because of the porch. I said, the Alderton porch? She said, it faces west, it gets the evening light. I thought, if I'm going to be somewhere alone, I want to see the evening light. I said, and? She said, and I got here and saw your porch across the hollow and thought, that one faces better. I said, you can sit on it whenever you want. She said, you can sit on it. She said it the way she says things, simply, directly, the way of someone for whom the true thing is always the most efficient thing. She knows, she has known, I think, since March at the latest, and I have known since I stopped being able to explain to myself why I was checking the west fence line twice a week in January. The light still comes on every evening, hers and mine both. The hollow between them is not empty anymore. She kept the light on for 6 months. I came when I was ready. She said, I wondered when you'd come. I should have come sooner, but I came, and the hollow is full of light now. That's the whole story. That's everything. I want to tell you about the evening in April when she came to my porch without a reason. Not apple butter, not a fence question, not lumber or tools or anything practical. She came up my porch steps at 7 in the evening with Ptolemy at her heel and nothing in her hands, and she said, I just wanted to sit on a porch that faces southeast. I said, that's as good a reason as any. She sat in the second chair. I had put a second chair out sometime in March, which I had told myself was for general hospitality purposes, and which was specifically for this. And Ptolemy settled on the porch boards between us, and we sat in the April evening and watched the hollow go through its colors, and did not say much for a long time, which was the best conversation I had had in recent memory. She said, eventually, you're easy to sit with. I said, you are too. She said, not everyone is. I said, no. She said, I was worried when I moved here that the quiet would be the wrong kind. I said, what kind is that? She said, the kind that's just absence. The kind where the quiet doesn't have anything in it. I thought about 11 years of sitting on this porch and what the quiet had had in it. I said, what kind is it now? She looked at the hollow, at the ridge above it, at the first soft green of April on the trees that were just starting to leaf out. She said, the other kind. I said, full quiet. She said, full quiet. We stayed until the stars came. She went home with Ptolemy across the hollow, and I watched her porch light come on when she went inside, which it always did, which I had been watching do for 7 months, and I sat on my southeast-facing porch in the full quiet of an April night in Harlan County, with the second chair empty beside me, and I thought, this is what I was waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. May arrived, and with it the specific kind of morning that belongs only to Kentucky in late spring. The dew on the pasture, the specific green of the hills before the heat settles in. The way the air at 5:30 has a quality that makes the whole day seem possible. I was checking the south fence when I heard her truck on the hollow road and looked up, and she was going toward town. She slowed at my gate and put the window down, and she said, I'm going to the feed store. You need anything? I said, half-inch staples if they have them. She said, how many boxes? I said, 2. She said, I'll put it on my tab. I said, you don't have to do that. She said, I know. She drove away. She came back 2 hours later and left the staples on my porch step with a piece of paper that said, "Staples, 2 boxes, cost one dinner." I made her dinner that Friday. I made the biscuits she had heard about from Darlene Combs and a proper pot roast because it was May and still cool enough to justify it. And she brought a jar of her apple preserves and a bottle of something she said she had brought from Virginia and had been saving for the right occasion. She looked at the dinner and then at me and said, "You do make good biscuits." I said, "Darlene Combs was right." She said, "Darlene Combs is always right. It's terrible." We ate dinner, and then we sat on my porch in the May evening, and she had the blanket she had started leaving on the second chair sometime in April, which I had not moved and had no intention of moving. Ptolemy slept at our feet. The hollow was dark and full and warm, and across it the Alderton farmhouse, her farmhouse now, sat with its porch light off because she was here, on my porch, and the light across the hollow was unnecessary. That was the first time the light was off. I noticed it the way you notice when something that has always been there is suddenly not there. Not with alarm, with something warmer. She was here. She didn't need the light to tell me she was there. She was right here. June, July. The orchard came into full leaf, and the kitchen garden she had restored behind the farmhouse was producing everything it had been put in to produce, and she brought me things from it the way you bring things from a garden to someone who is close enough to share it. A basket of green beans here, a bag of tomatoes there, twice a jar of something she'd put up that afternoon and left on my step without knocking because she knew I was in the far pasture and would find it when I came in. I left things on her step too. A dressed chicken when I butchered in July, sweet corn from my grandmother's plot, once, in the middle of August, a jar of honey from the hives I keep at the edge of the orchard, with a note that said, "From the bees that have been working your apple flowers. Fair trade." She texted me. We had exchanged numbers sometime in April, practically, because of the fence. And the text said, "This is the best honey I've ever had." I texted back, "The apple flowers help." She sent back a single word, "Yes." August. She came to my porch on a Tuesday evening in August, and she sat in the second chair, and she did not say anything for a while, which was normal, and then she said, "Eli." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I need to tell you something." I said, "Okay." She looked at the hollow, at the ridge, at the darkening sky above the ridge. She said, "I left a place in Virginia where I had been for 7 years and where everything was right except the main thing." I said, "What was the main thing?" She said, "I was alone in the wrong way. The way you are when you are with people, but still essentially alone." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I bought the Alderton place because I wanted to try alone in the right way, where the alone was something I chose rather than something that happened to me." I said, "And?" She said, "And I got here and saw your porch light across the hollow and thought, there's a man who's been alone for a long time." I said, "I have been." She said, "I could tell." She paused. "I kept the porch light on because I wanted you to know I was there. Not to rush you, just so you knew the hollow wasn't empty anymore." I said, "It helped." She said, "I know." She looked at me directly. "What I'm trying to say, in a very inefficient way, is that the wrong kind of alone is gone. And I think that's because of you. And I didn't want to not say it." I looked at her in the August evening on my southeast facing porch, with Ptolemy between us and the full Kentucky summer around us, and I said, "The hollow hasn't been empty since September." She said, "No." I said, "I noticed the light every single evening." She said, "I know." I said, "I should have come sooner." She said, "You came when you were ready." I said, "October was ready." She said, "You came in December, for a fence." I said, "The fence needed fixing." She said, "Eli." I said, "It did." She was laughing now, the real one, the full one, the one that had been building since March on a repaired porch step and 2 cups of coffee and a blanket split without discussing it. I was laughing too. Ptolemy raised his head to look at us and then put it back down, satisfied that nothing alarming was happening. We sat on the porch until the stars were fully out, which in Harlan County in August means the full weight of them, the specific richness of a sky with no competing light for miles in any direction except for two farmhouse porches across a hollow. When she went home, I watched her light come on across the way. I thought, that light has been the best thing about my evenings since September. I thought, she kept it burning so I would know she was there. She kept it burning for 6 months, patiently, on the theory that when I was ready, I would come. And she was right, and I came. And the hollow has not been empty since. She is fixing the east gable window this week. I am helping on Saturday. She said she doesn't need the help. I know she doesn't. I'm coming anyway, without a reason. Without's how it counts now. That's how it always counted. Last week, I asked her when she decided to keep the light on. Not why. She had told me why. When. What moment specifically. She thought about it the way she thought about things. Not performing the thinking, actually doing it. Then she said, the third evening. I'd been here 3 evenings and I'd seen you on your porch all 3 times. And I thought, he's been sitting there alone for a long time and he doesn't know anyone is across the way now. So I went and turned on the porch light and I thought, if he can see it, he'll know. I said, I could see it. She said, I know. I said, from the first night. She said, did it help right away? I thought about the first Thursday in September. The specific feeling of looking across the hollow and seeing a light that had not been there the night before. The particular quality of that feeling, not quite surprise, not quite relief, something between the two. I said, yes, right away. She said, good. And then, I was worried it might be strange. A light from someone you don't know. I said, it wasn't strange. She said, what was it? I said, like finding out the hollow had been listening all along and finally decided to say something back. She was quiet for a moment. Then, that's the most I've heard you say at once. I said, don't get used to it. She said, too late. We were on my porch when she said that, the southeast facing one that gets the morning light, the one I sat on alone for 11 years and have been sitting on with her, sometimes on the evenings she comes, for the past 7 months. The second chair has a blanket on it that she left in April. I have not moved it. I will not move it. The light was on again last night, across the hollow, and mine was on too, and the hollow between them was not empty. It hasn't been empty since September. It won't be empty again. She kept the light on. I came when I was ready. She said, I wondered when you'd come. I'm here now. That's the whole story. The hollow is full of light. One more thing, because it belongs here and I haven't said it yet. In October, this October, the second one, she took me to the orchard on a Sunday morning. The apple trees she put in a year ago in bare root faith were holding their first real fruit, small green apples that had come through the summer and were just beginning to soften toward yellow at the edges. She walked the rows slowly, checking each tree, and I walked beside her, and she told me the names of the varieties: winesap, stamen, limbertwig, Virginia crab, and what each one was good for, which ones made the best cider, and which ones stored longest in a root cellar, and which ones you ate right off the tree in October before they got any better ideas about themselves. I said, you knew all this before you put them in. She said, I had to. You can't put in an orchard and then figure out what you planted. I said, I mean, you knew what you were doing. She said, I knew what I was trying to do. I said, there's a difference? She stopped at the winesap tree, the largest of the first-year trees, the one she had put in the southwest corner, where it would get the most light, and she looked at it for a moment. Then she said, knowing what you're trying to do is what gets you through the first year, when nothing is certain. The second year, you know what you're doing. I thought about September and the light coming on and the 11 years before it. I thought about December and a fence, and April and a second chair and a blanket. I thought about August and the real thing being said on the southeast porch without being dressed up as something else. I said, what year are we in? She looked at the winesap tree, then at me. Her expression, the direct one, the one where she has already thought about what she is going to say and has decided to say it plainly, was the expression I had been reading since March and had come to understand as the truest version of her face. She said, "The second year." I stood in her orchard in the second October with Ptolemy at our feet and the apples hanging heavy and small on the first year trees, and I understood. The orchard and the hollow and the light and the fence and the porch steps and the apple butter and the dinner and the blanket and the second chair and everything that had accumulated between September and October had been the first year, the year of trying to do something. The second year is the year of knowing. The apples are small and green and getting yellow at the edges. The hollow is full of light. The second chair has a blanket on it. She kept the light on for 6 months, and I came when I was ready. And she said she wondered when I'd come, and I said I should have come sooner. And she said I came when I was ready. And I think she was right, and I think October, this October, the second one, is the proof of it. The light still comes on across the hollow every evening. Mine too. Both of them. The hollow between them full of the specific dark of a Kentucky night with no competing light for miles, except for these two farmhouses and their porches and the people on them who can see each other's lights from their own. That's enough. That's everything. That's the whole story.